Thousands of Israeli troops continue to amass at the border with Gaza, as U.S. President Joe Biden warns that an occupation of the Palestinian enclave would be a mistake.
Exit polls predict a change of government and direction for Poland, with the return of Donald Tusk's civic coalition.
Israeli troops continue to amass near Gaza ahead of an expected ground offensive. Supported by U.S. Navy ships in the region, these troops appear positioned for a campaign to dismantle the Hamas militant group. But U.S. President Joe Biden warns any Israeli occupation of Gaza would be a, quote, big mistake. So far, a week of intensive airstrikes have demolished entire areas of the Gaza Strip, but has failed to stop rockets fired towards Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who met with the families of people abducted by Hamas, has vowed to destroy the group. Roughly 150 people were taken by the militants last Saturday during a surprise assault on Israeli towns and villages. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is on a diplomatic mission in the region, is to make a last-ditch attempt to reduce the impact of an all-out Israeli land assault on Gaza. He's returning to Jerusalem for more talks with Netanyahu. Meanwhile, it's feared the escalating Palestinian death toll will rise dramatically, provoking intervention by the wider Middle East. With Israeli airstrikes continuing and food, power, and medicines in scarce supply due to Israel's blockade, conditions for people in Gaza are worsening. Water is said to have been turned back on, but without electricity to pump it, the problem remains. Thousands of people have been evacuated from Gaza City after Israeli warnings to move south ahead of the offensive. Meanwhile, the population of Khan Yunis city has doubled overnight.
Facing the prospect of a total loss of essential food, medical supplies, water and electricity, hospitals in Gaza say they are at the point of collapse. Far from being able to evacuate patients, one surgeon told the AP news agency that his hospital is overwhelmed with people seeking refuge.
There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people who have sought refuge in the hospital, in the grounds, but also inside the hospital, in the stairwells, in the corridors, in the wards between the patient beds, unless there's a humanitarian corridor to supply the hospitals and to evacuate the wounded. Unless there's a cessation to the bombing, then this place is heading to absolute disaster.
The dire situation is taking a heavy toll on health workers, and hospitals say some staff have been killed or have had to flee. As the death toll rises, even dealing with bodies has reached crisis point. Gaza's morgues have run out of space and ice cream vans are being used to temporarily store the remains of the dead.
Harrowing scenes outside the home of one of Iran's most prominent filmmakers. Iranian director Dariush Merjoui and his wife, screenwriter Vahideh Mohammedefar, were stabbed to death on Saturday. Both suffered multiple neck wounds. Authorities have not revealed the motive behind these murders, but 4 suspects have been identified, 2 of whom have been arrested. Merjoui rose to prominence in 1969 for directing the critically acclaimed movie The Crow, one of the first films to spark Iran's new wave genre.
Russian President Vladimir Putin may be trying to temper expectations of significant Russian advances around Avdiivka in Donetsk region. So is the Russian information space, notes the Institute for the Study of War in its latest update. The think tank says Russian bloggers initially reported maximalist and unverifiable claims of Russian advances over 10 kilometers here in this area, likely exaggerated the degree of Russian successes near Avdiivka during the initial offensive operations and expressed optimism for rapid Russian advances. Some of them have since acknowledged difficulties in the Russian advance near Avdiivka and even noted that Russian forces decreased the pace of offensive operations around the settlement. Russian bloggers have also begun to claim that intense and attritional fighting is ongoing around Avdiivka, where Russian forces have yet to make further gains amid a likely decreasing tempo. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled more than 15 Russian assaults near Avdiivka, as well as northwest and southwest of the settlement. Now, the Institute for the Study of War has not yet observed a visual confirmation of previous claims of Russian advances in the area or geolocated footage of any other Russian gains. And it states that they are unlikely to make significant breakthroughs or cut off Ukrainian forces in the settlement in the near term, and potential advances at scale would likely require a significant and protracted commitment of personnel and material.
Leaders have begun arriving for a forum on China's Belt and Road Initiative, at which Beijing and Moscow are expected to deepen their burgeoning economic ties. Talks in Beijing between the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers were seen as paving the way for a visit by Vladimir Putin to the event in the coming days. The Russian president has recently praised China's strategic global ambitions.
У нас вот за предыдущий период рост товарооборота составил 32%. Это очень хороший рост. И в конце года есть все основания полагать, что мы достигнем планки 200 миллиардов.
Under the Belt and Road Initiative, China has struck deals with a number of countries to build roads, railways and other infrastructure projects that they would otherwise struggle to afford. The forum marks the 10-year anniversary of China's long-term plan to expand its influence around the world.
Students and staff at a school in the French town of Arras have paid a solemn, silent tribute to teacher Dominique Bernard, who was fatally stabbed by a suspected Islamist militant last week. They were joined by colleagues across the country. President Emmanuel Macron held a special security meeting as France remained on heightened terror alert in the aftermath of the attack. With the nation in shock, the government is trying to reassure people that schools are safe.
Dire notre soutien à toutes les équipes du lycée Gambetta, aux parents, aux élèves, et plus généralement assurer tous les enseignants de France de notre mobilisation et de notre soutien.
But even as the Prime Minister offered support, her words were undermined by a false bomb alert that caused the school at Arras to be evacuated for a short time. As the country mourned Dominique Bernard, it also honoured the memory of another teacher, Samuel Paty, who was murdered in similar circumstances in Paris exactly 3 years ago.
Poland looks set to welcome a new government after nearly 8 years of right-wing Confederation Party rule. The Law and Justice Party won the most votes in Sunday's parliamentary election, but exit polls suggest the opposition leader, Donald Tusk, should be able to form a majority with 2 other parties. The Civic Coalition leader previously held office for 7 years.
Jeśli chodzi o mnie, jestem bardzo zadowolona i wierzę w to, że w końcu Polska po prostu będzie bliżej Europy i że po prostu będziemy naprawdę poważani teraz w Europie i że wrócą te dobre czasy, a nie średniowiecze, które było.
Jestem rozczarowana wynikami, ale przyjmuję demokratyczny wybór. Jeszcze chyba nie mamy wyników, były to tylko wyniki sondażowe, niemniej one wskazują na zwycięstwo, tak się nazywają, demokratyczną opozycją. Ja sądzę, że moje ugrupowanie jest też demokratyczne. Głosowałam na PiS.
The full results of the election should be known by Tuesday. Relations between Warsaw and the EU have soured in recent years. Poland's judicial reforms violated EU law, and the ruling party has been criticised for its anti-migrant position.
This picturesque island off the coast of Italy is the birthplace to a manifesto that laid the foundations of the European Union some 80 years ago. The Ventotene Declaration calls for peace, solidarity, and federalism. And it became one of the main documents from which the philosophy of the EU was based. Nearly a century later, Bridge Generation, an association of young Italians calling for dialogue between different cultures, aims to bridge the EU of today with that origin story by hosting a festival of support in Europe and the Mediterranean in this historic place.
Abbiamo deciso di portare qua il nostro festival perché in qualche modo ci riconosciamo in quello che è il manifesto di Ventotene, un manifesto che è stato scritto durante il regime fascista dagli oppositori del regime per provare a raccontare, immaginare un'Europa diversa, un'Europa in cui i popoli si incontrano, dialogano e convivono.
È uno spazio che riunisce i rifugiati, seconde generazioni, politici, giornalisti, scrittori, per fare un racconto collettivo di pratiche vincenti per superare discriminazione e razzismo e ovviamente promuovere anche la cultura europea fondata sulla pace e sulla democrazia.
80 anni fa, durante il conflitto mondiale, su quest'isola nasceva un'idea rivoluzionaria, creare una federazione di Stati europei che fosse garanzia di pace e solidarietà. Oggi il manifesto di Ventotene è uno dei documenti fondanti dell'Unione Europea. Eppure ci dice anche che c'è ancora parecchia strada da fare.
Altiero Spinelli is one of the founding fathers of the European Union. Before he died, he asked for his ashes to be scattered on the 3 kilometers long strip of land, which is where he was incarcerated by the former fascist regime and where he wrote the manifesto. Today, this detention facility attracts hundreds of visitors every year, inspiring a new generation of Europeans who want to support a united continent.
Io un po' mi sento una generazione ponte tra la generazione dei padri e delle madri che diciamo sono arrivati e hanno costruito il proprio progetto di vita migratorio in Italia e chi poi l'Italia come me, come tanti altri che sono qui, è diventato il loro paese.
The message coming through from the small island in the Mediterranean Sea is loud and clear. The path ahead is a difficult one, but the young Europeans of today are up for the challenge.